Paul Newman exposed the 5 directors who destroyed lives. Those legendary blue eyes didn't miss much. Throughout his decades in Hollywood, Paul Newman worked with some of cinema's most celebrated directors, observing firsthand how the pursuit of cinematic perfection could cross troubling lines. While audiences saw only the finished masterpieces, Newman witnessed the human cost behind certain iconic films. Paul had this unique perspective, revealed a longtime friend who collaborated with Newman on multiple projects. He'd experienced Hollywood from nearly every angle, as a beginning actor, as a superstar, as a director himself. That journey gave him clarity about the difference between demanding excellence and something more troubling. He could distinguish between directors who pushed people to their best and those who broke something in them along the way. Unlike many stars who maintained Hollywood's code of silence, Newman occasionally shared unfiltered observations with trusted colleagues about directing methods he considered genuinely harmful. These weren't complaints about long hours or creative disagreements, but concerns about psychological tactics that left lasting damage on vulnerable performers. Tonight we reveal the 5 directors who earned places on Newman's private list of filmmakers whose methods crossed ethical lines, the visionaries whose artistic achievements came at a human cost that Newman believed was both unnecessary and indefensible. Let's begin with the filmmaker whose notorious temper and psychological tactics represented exactly the kind of directing approach that Newman found most troubling, someone whose brilliant films were matched by equally memorable accounts of on-set cruelty.
Suggested that I should do something. He said, you do whatever you like, you want to be an actor, fine.
Otto Preminger, the calculated cruelty. With his distinctive accent and intimidating physical presence, Otto Preminger created groundbreaking films that challenged censorship and explored controversial themes. Behind that artistic courage, however, lay directing methods that Newman considered genuinely harmful, particularly in Preminger's treatment of vulnerable young actresses. Known for his bold filmmaking and his brutal methods, noted a film historian who documented accounts from Preminger's sets. Newman had observed Preminger's approach during his early years in Hollywood and was struck by the director's deliberate use of fear and humiliation as tools to extract performances, tactics that seemed less about artistic necessity than about power and control. Preminger's directing style often involved deliberately provoking emotional reactions through persistent criticism, public humiliation, and psychological pressure, rather than through collaborative artistic guidance. This approach was particularly evident in his treatment of less established performers who lacked the power or experience to protect themselves from his tactics. Preminger was cruel to actors, especially women, confirmed an actress who worked with Preminger and later discussed that experience with Newman. What disturbed Paul was the calculated nature of Preminger's cruelty, how he would deliberately target vulnerabilities, create hostile environments, and then film the resulting genuine distress while presenting it as a directed performance. The most notorious example of this approach involved Jean Seberg during the filming of St. Joan, 1957. As a 19-year-old with minimal acting experience, Seberg was particularly vulnerable to Preminger's psychological tactics, a vulnerability the director exploited throughout the production. He once made Jean Seberg do over 30 takes of a breakdown scene, until she was sobbing for real, said a crew member who witnessed the filming. It wasn't about helping her find the character's emotion through artistic direction. It was about breaking down her defenses until her genuine distress became available for the camera. The line between directed performance and documented suffering disappeared entirely. Newman's assessment of Preminger's methods came from both direct observation and conversations with actors who had experienced his approach firsthand. These accounts painted a consistent picture of a director who valued captured authenticity over performer well-being, regardless of the long-term consequences. He didn't direct emotion, he tortured people until it broke through, Newman reportedly told a colleague after discussing Preminger with actors from his productions. Paul made an important distinction, the colleague later explained. He understood that directing sometimes requires pushing actors beyond comfort zones. What troubled him about Preminger was that the discomfort wasn't a side effect of the artistic process. It was the actual mechanism. The suffering was the method itself. The consequences of this approach extended beyond the temporary distress of difficult shooting days. For performers like Seberg, the psychological impact of Preminger's methods created lasting damage that affected both their subsequent work and their personal well-being. Seberg never fully recovered, and Preminger never apologized, noted a biographer who documented Seberg's troubled career and eventual tragic death. Newman saw in Seberg's experience a particularly disturbing example of how certain directors' methods could leave lasting trauma that followed performers long after productions ended, creating psychological burdens that some carried for the remainder of their careers and lives. What particularly concerned Newman about Preminger's approach was how it was often defended or dismissed within the industry as necessary for artistic achievement or simply as the cost of working with a genius. This normalization of harmful methods struck Newman as both morally indefensible and artistically unnecessary. Newman believed great performances could emerge from trust rather than terror, explained a director who discussed filmmaking philosophy with Newman. He had witnessed and experienced approaches that created safe environments for emotional vulnerability rather than manufacturing distress through cruelty. For Paul, Preminger represented an approach to directing that caused harm that no artistic achievement could justify. This perspective informed Newman's own directing style and his choices about which directors he would work with throughout his career. He consistently sought collaborators who could achieve artistic excellence without psychological manipulation or deliberate cruelty, demonstrating through his own choices that alternative approaches were both possible and effective.
It could be helped, and we worked on the script together. We'd also met a fellow in Hoboken.
Elia Kazan, The Professional Betrayal. Elia Kazan presented a unique and complex case in Newman's assessment of troubling directors. Unlike filmmakers whose concerning behavior occurred primarily on set, Kazan's most controversial actions took place in a congressional hearing room, yet had consequences that rippled throughout the industry and destroyed dozens of careers and lives. A directing genius, and Hollywood's greatest betrayer, observed a film scholar who studied both Kazan's artistic contributions and his controversial testimony. Newman's perspective on Kazan was particularly nuanced because he genuinely respected Kazan's artistic brilliance while finding his decision to name names before HUAC morally indefensible, a tension that reflected the industry's broader struggle with Kazan's complex legacy. In 1952, appearing before the House Un-American Activities Committee investigating supposed communist influence in Hollywood, Kazan named 8 of his former colleagues from the group theater as Communist Party members. This testimony provided the committee with credible confirmation from a respected industry figure and led directly to those individuals being blacklisted from working in film, television, or theater. In 1952, Kazan named names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, a move that destroyed dozens of careers, families, and reputations, confirmed a historian who documented the blacklist era. What particularly troubled Newman about Kazan's testimony wasn't just the act itself, but the context. These were colleagues who had trusted Kazan, worked closely with him, and shared the vulnerable early stages of their careers with him. This breach of professional trust represented for Newman a fundamental betrayal of the collaborative relationships that make filmmaking possible. While directing requires authority and decisive leadership, it also depends on performers' willingness to make themselves emotionally vulnerable, a vulnerability that becomes impossible when trust has been fundamentally broken. Newman said he made on the waterfront, and then he made enemies out of everyone who trusted him, recalled a colleague who discussed Kazan with Newman during the controversy surrounding the director's honorary Oscar in 1999. That comment captured Paul's central critique of Kazan, that his artistic achievements, however significant, couldn't be separated from his betrayal of the trust that artistic collaboration requires. The consequences of Kazan's testimony extended far beyond professional setbacks for those he named. Many experienced not just career destruction, but financial ruin, family breakdown, and profound psychological harm that followed them for decades. The ripple effects touched families, creative communities, and the broader cultural environment of American film. Brilliant on set, poison in history, noted a director who discussed Kazan's complex legacy with Newman. Paul understood the artistic contributions Kazan had made to American cinema and theater. What he couldn't reconcile was how those contributions could justify actions that caused such profound and lasting harm to so many people whose only crime had been political beliefs they had already abandoned years earlier. Newman's assessment of Kazan was complicated by his own near miss with the blacklist era. Early in his career, Newman had been mistaken for another actor with similar politics, almost finding himself called before HUAC. This brush with the machinery of political persecution gave him a personal appreciation for the fear and vulnerability experienced by those Kazan named. Newman had seen how quickly careers could be destroyed by mere association or accusation, explained someone familiar with this period of Newman's life. That experience informed his view of Kazan's testimony, understanding that when Kazan provided those names, he wasn't just sharing information, but actively participating in a process designed to punish political thought through economic destruction. What made Kazan's case particularly complex for Newman was the director's attempt to justify his testimony through his art, most notably in On the Waterfront, which many interpret as Kazan's defense of informing. The film's famous "I Could Have Been a Contender" scene and its portrayal of the moral necessity of breaking silence against corruption struck Newman as a self-serving attempt to reframe betrayal as courage. Newman respected the film as art, while rejecting its subtext as justification, noted a critic who discussed On the Waterfront with Newman. Paul saw the film's brilliance, while also recognizing its function as Kazan's attempt to rewrite his own moral narrative, to cast himself as the hero, rather than addressing the real harm his testimony had caused to real people. This tension between artistic achievement and ethical conduct represented for Newman a fundamental question about how the industry should evaluate directors' legacies, whether brilliant work could redeem or excuse actions that caused demonstrable harm to others, particularly when that harm stemmed from a betrayal of professional trust rather than artistic demands.
Material first. Now the question, when you have, we'll say, basic...
Alfred Hitchcock, the master of control. Few directors in Hollywood history achieved greater critical acclaim or commercial success than Alfred Hitchcock. Behind the distinctive profile and droll public persona, however, lay directing methods that Newman considered deeply troubling, particularly in Hitchcock's treatment of the blonde actresses who became his trademark. The master of suspense had a dark obsession with control, said a film scholar who studied Hitchcock's directing techniques. Newman recognized Hitchcock's technical brilliance and narrative mastery. What concerned him was how Hitchcock's need for control extended beyond the filmmaking process into attempts to dominate the personal lives, professional choices, and even physical autonomy of certain actresses. This controlling approach was most evident in Hitchcock's relationship with Tippi Hedren during the filming of The Birds, 1963, and Marnie, 1964. What began as the typical director-actress relationship evolved into something Newman and others found deeply concerning, a pattern of escalating control, isolation, and eventual retribution when that control was challenged. He tormented Tippi Hedren, throwing live birds at her, isolating her, and allegedly blacklisting her when she refused his advances, confirmed a researcher who documented accounts from Hitchcock's productions. What particularly disturbed Newman about the Hedren situation was how Hitchcock's artistic authority became a vehicle for personal control, how the legitimate need for a director to guide performance transformed into something that looked much more like obsession and punishment. The notorious filming of the attic scene in The Birds exemplified this troubling approach. Rather than using the mechanical or trained birds employed throughout most of the production, Hitchcock insisted on using live birds for the scene's climax, with crew members actually throwing them directly at Hedren take after take, resulting in genuine injuries and trauma that the camera captured as performance. Newman respected Hitchcock's talent, but called him a cold manipulator, recalled a director who discussed Hitchcock's methods with Newman. Paul made an important distinction between directing that elicits authentic emotion through artistic collaboration and directing that manufactures genuine distress through deliberate cruelty. For him, Hitchcock too often crossed that line, particularly with actresses who had the least power to protect themselves. What made Hitchcock's case particularly complex was how his artistic brilliance and commercial success insulated him from consequences or criticism. The industry's willingness to overlook concerning behavior because of valuable creative output represented for Newman a moral failure that extended beyond any individual director to implicate the broader Hollywood system. He didn't just direct fear, he created it and lived off it, noted a film historian familiar with Newman's perspective. Paul saw in Hitchcock a particularly troubling example of how the industry would tolerate almost any behavior from directors who delivered commercial and critical success, creating an environment where artistic achievement effectively placed certain individuals beyond normal ethical boundaries. The consequences of this approach extended beyond the production itself to affect performers' subsequent careers and personal well-being. In Hedren's case, Her resistance to Hitchcock's controlling behavior allegedly resulted in him holding her to her contract while refusing to use her in productions and blocking opportunities with other directors, effectively ending a promising career just as it was beginning. Newman saw the Hedren situation as particularly revealing of the power imbalance in Hollywood, explained someone familiar with Newman's thinking. When a director could not only control an actor's experience on set, but potentially end their entire career, if they resisted that control, it created a fundamentally coercive environment that made true consent or collaboration impossible. This perspective informed Newman's own directing philosophy and his choices about which directors he would work with throughout his career. He consistently sought collaborators who achieved their artistic vision through respect and collaboration rather than through fear and domination, demonstrating through his own choices that alternative approaches were both possible and effective.
At one time in a film called Straw Dogs, there's no history in the world of anybody except that of Christ.
Sam Peckinpah, The Volatile Vision. Sam Peckinpah revolutionized American cinema with his innovative approach to depicting violence, particularly in westerns like The Wild Bunch. Behind that revolutionary vision, however, lay a directing process characterized by chaos, volatility, and behavior that Newman considered genuinely harmful to both productions and the people involved in them. A genius of violent cinema and a destructive force off-screen, observed a filmmaker who discussed Peckinpah with Newman. What concerned Paul about Peckinpah wasn't just typical difficult behavior, but the way his personal demons actively disrupted the filmmaking process and created genuinely unsafe environments, not just emotionally, but sometimes physically as well. Peckinpah's struggles with alcohol and emotional volatility created uniquely challenging production environments. Unlike directors whose difficult methods were at least consistent and predictable, Peckinpah's behavior could shift dramatically from day to day, creating an atmosphere of constant uncertainty that affected everyone involved in his films. Peckinpah was notorious for drunken rages, verbal abuse, and emotional breakdowns on set, confirmed a crew member who worked on several Peckinpah productions. What Newman found particularly concerning was how Peckinpah's personal issues became everyone else's professional problem, how his inability or unwillingness to manage his own behavior created ripple effects that damaged productions and the people working on them. This volatility created a distinctive kind of fear among actors who worked with Peckinpah. Unlike the calculated manipulation of directors like Hitchcock, Peckinpah's unpredictability meant performers never knew what version of the director they would encounter on any given day, creating an atmosphere where everyone remained in a constant state of high alert. Actors feared being cast in his films and feared being cut out even more, noted a casting director familiar with how performers viewed Peckinpah projects. Newman observed an unusual dynamic where actors were simultaneously drawn to Peckinpah's artistic vision and terrified of the process of realizing it, creating a relationship built on a complex mixture of creative respect and genuine apprehension. Newman's assessment of Peckinpah came primarily through conversations with actors and crew members who had worked with him directly. These accounts painted a consistent picture of someone whose artistic brilliance came packaged with behaviors that created genuine harm, from verbal abuse that crossed into personal cruelty to physical conditions that sometimes placed people at actual risk. Newman said, "He didn't make westerns, he made war zones," recalled a colleague who discussed Peckinpah with Newman. That comment reflected Paul's understanding that Peckinpah didn't just depict chaos on screen, he created it around him during the production process, with real casualties that extended beyond bruised egos to include psychological distress and occasionally physical danger. What complicated the industry's relationship with Peckinpah was the undeniable power of his finished films. The same volatile energy that made his sets so challenging also translated into groundbreaking cinema that forever changed how violence was depicted on screen. This created the moral question that concerned Newman most: whether artistic achievement justified methods that caused demonstrable harm. For Newman, the answer was clearly no, explained a director who discussed filmmaking ethics with Newman. Paul believed that great art could and should be created without destroying people in the process. He had experienced directors who achieved artistic excellence through respect and professionalism, proving that Peckinpah's volatile approach wasn't necessary for powerful filmmaking. It was simply the path of least resistance for someone unwilling to manage their own demons. This perspective informed Newman's choices about which directors he would work with throughout his career. He consistently avoided collaborations with filmmakers known for volatile or abusive methods, regardless of their artistic reputation, demonstrating through his own choices that maintaining personal standards didn't require sacrificing artistic quality.
We fucked around for an hour and 20 minutes.
No, they
we
had
moved over here.
Then we had, I mean, I know it seems like a lot of tea breaks, but we had the tea break that was over there.
Stanley Kubrick, the obsessive perfectionist. Stanley Kubrick's place in cinema history is secure. A visionary director whose meticulous approach to every aspect of filmmaking produced some of the medium's most enduring masterpieces. Behind those perfect compositions and landmark performances, however, lay methods that Newman and others found deeply concerning in their impact on the humans tasked with realizing Kubrick's exacting vision. Respected, feared, obsessive beyond reason, observed a film critic who discussed Kubrick with Newman. What troubled Paul about Kubrick wasn't the pursuit of excellence itself. Newman was known for his own perfectionism in certain aspects of his craft. It was Kubrick's apparent indifference to the human cost of that pursuit, his willingness to push people far beyond reasonable limits in service of his vision, regardless of the consequences. Kubrick's directing approach was characterized by exhaustive repetition, demanding dozens or even hundreds of takes of the same scene without clear communication about what he was seeking. This method created not just physical exhaustion, but a particular kind of psychological distress as performers desperately attempted to determine what would finally satisfy the director's unstated expectations. Kubrick once made Shelley Duvall do 127 takes of a single scene in The Shining, pushing her to the edge of a nervous breakdown, confirmed a crew member who documented the production. Newman saw in this approach something fundamentally dehumanizing, treating actors not as creative collaborators, but as elements to be manipulated and exhausted until they could no longer maintain any pretense or performance, leaving only raw, genuine distress for the camera to capture. The effects of this approach were visible in the physical and psychological state of actors during Kubrick productions. Duvall's experience on The Shining became particularly notorious, with behind-the-scenes footage showing her presenting symptoms of extreme stress, including hair loss, physical illness, and emotional breakdown, conditions that Kubrick not only accepted, but apparently cultivated as part of his process. He manipulated, isolated, and reshaped people to fit his vision, no matter the cost, said someone familiar with multiple Kubrick productions. What Newman found particularly troubling was Kubrick's tendency to deliberately isolate actors from support systems, create environments of constant uncertainty, and use psychological tactics that appeared designed to manufacture genuine distress rather than guide performance. Newman's assessment of Kubrick was particularly noteworthy because he deliberately chose never to work with the director despite opportunities to do so, a decision that reflected his personal boundaries regarding directing methods he considered ethically indefensible regardless of the artistic results they might produce. Paul Newman never worked with him and said, "That wasn't directing, that was psychological warfare," recalled a colleague familiar with Newman's decision to decline a Kubrick project. This wasn't about artistic disagreement, but about fundamental ethics. Paul's belief that no film, regardless of its potential brilliance, was worth participating in processes he considered genuinely harmful. What made Kubrick's case particularly significant was how his undeniable artistic achievements were used to justify methods that would be considered unacceptable in virtually any other professional context. The resulting films are unquestionably landmarks of cinema, but for Newman, that success couldn't excuse or redeem the means by which it was achieved. Kubrick made masterpieces and left trauma behind them, noted a film historian familiar with accounts from Kubrick productions. Newman's perspective challenged the industry's tendency to separate artistic achievement from the process that created it, arguing instead that how art is made matters as much as the final result, and that human dignity shouldn't be sacrificed even in service of creating landmark cinema. This perspective reflected Newman's broader philosophy about the relationship between art and ethics, his belief that creative excellence and human decency weren't competing values, but essential companions. Through his own career choices, Newman demonstrated that artistic integrity included not just the quality of the work, but the integrity of the process that created it. As we consider Newman's assessments of these 5 directors, patterns emerge that reveal much about both the filmmakers themselves and Newman's own values regarding the relationship between art and ethics. Each director represented a different approach to prioritizing vision over humanity. Preminger through calculated cruelty, Kazan through professional betrayal, Hitchcock through controlling manipulation, Peckinpah through volatile unpredictability, and Kubrick through obsessive perfectionism. Newman saw these five as representing different aspects of the same fundamental problem, observed director Sidney Pollack, who worked with Newman on Absence of Malice and discussed directing ethics extensively with him. Paul believed that filmmaking had developed a dangerous mythology, the idea that great art required or justified methods that would be considered abusive in any other context. He rejected that premise entirely. This rejection informed Newman's own approach to acting, directing, and his choices about collaborators throughout his career. As his star power grew and his ability to select projects increased, he consistently chose directors known for achieving excellence through respect and collaboration, rather than through fear and manipulation, demonstrating through his own career that alternative approaches were both possible and effective. Paul's assessments of these troubling directors wasn't just about criticism, but about establishing a counterexample, explained a producer who worked with Newman during the 1980s. He had witnessed approaches to filmmaking that he found ethically indefensible, and he made conscious choices to demonstrate that artistic excellence didn't require abusive methods, that the tortured genius model of directing was a choice rather than a necessity. What gives Newman's perspective particular value isn't just his status within the industry, but his own experience as a director. Having helmed films like Rachel and The Glass Menagerie, he understood firsthand the pressures and challenges of the director's chair, making his rejection of abusive methods more meaningful because it came from someone who had navigated those pressures without resorting to manipulation or cruelty. Newman directed his wife to an Oscar nomination without breaking her spirit in the process, noted a film historian familiar with Newman's directing work. That experience informed his fundamental belief that great performances could emerge from trust rather than terror, that creating safe environments for emotional vulnerability would produce results as powerful as those achieved through psychological manipulation without the accompanying trauma. The most significant insight from Newman's observations isn't about these specific directors, but about the broader system that enabled and rewarded their methods. Throughout Hollywood history, the industry has consistently prioritized results over process, artistic achievement over human welfare, and commercial success over ethical conduct, creating environments where abusive behavior could flourish without consequence, as long as the resulting films generated sufficient acclaim or profit. Newman's critique extended beyond individual directors to the industry that protected them, observed a critic who discussed Hollywood history with Newman. He saw how commercial considerations consistently overrode basic ethical standards, how critical acclaim insulated filmmakers from accountability for their methods, and how these patterns became self-perpetuating as each generation learned from and emulated its predecessors. In examining Newman's perspective on these directors, we gain insight not just into specific historical figures, but into the ongoing challenge of balancing artistic achievement with human dignity, a tension that continues to resonate in contemporary conversations about power, accountability, and the true cost of creating landmark cinema through methods that leave lasting damage on the people involved in its creation. The most powerful aspect of Newman's assessment was his insistence that the end doesn't justify the means, concluded a filmmaker influenced by Newman's example. Paul maintained throughout his career that how art is made matters, that processes that damage people can never be truly justified by the quality of the resulting work, regardless of its artistic or commercial success. That perspective remains as relevant today as it was during the era of these five directors. If you found this exploration illuminating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more examinations of cinema history. Share your thoughts in the comments about which of these revelations surprised you most, or what other aspects of filmmaking ethics you'd like us to explore in future videos. Remember that understanding the full context of cinema history, including its troubling aspects, helps us appreciate both groundbreaking artistic achievements and the human costs sometimes associated with their creation. This awareness encourages more ethical approaches to filmmaking that respect both artistic excellence and basic human dignity.